Hi, Cyndi. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
So thanks for joining me. And
Yeah,
you
thanks
have
for
your
inviting me.
your power lipstick for the election.
Absolutely.
You
Yes,
said.
I need to break out all the feminine power today.
Yeah, it's a pretty rough time. Yeah, I guess does it all happen? I'm really back on the US election. I was just watching like 22-minute kind of clips. So it was like this hour's 22 minutes sort of joke clips about how the US election is different from Canada. And I guess they vote on different days and there's just all kinds of different things happening, but is this the
I
final
mean,
day?
it's a completely different situation, and I mean, I think it's just part of we're in the middle of a pandemic. There's like a massive U.S. election with like some pretty, I think, serious like health equity Supreme Court decisions
Hmm.
potentially on the line in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I mean, because that's something I care about and I talk about all the time. Like on the one hand, it's across the border. I mean, I have loved ones and friends and colleagues, as we all do, because we live close to the border and we have cross-border lives.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's just kind of part of like the same pandemic feeling of like things being out of control, and so, or outside of your locus of control. And so I was like, you know what I can do today? I can record a podcast with you, and I can wear my like superpower bright red lipstick that I never wear. And if anybody knows me, I almost never wear makeup. So this is like just part of my, self-care today.
Yeah, yeah, it's like a totem. Yeah, you're like,
Yeah,
I'm gonna have this power symbol
exactly.
to represent like, yeah, to be in the aura of RBG or something. Like, yeah.
Yeah, or AOC.
Yeah.
Yeah, as the
Yeah.
case may be. Yeah.
Yeah. It's good. Yeah. It's good. Yeah, you're right. It's like, yeah, what can I control in these moments? Like I can record a podcast, I can wear lipstick
Hmm. I
and pray.
can, do some yoga later. I can go for a
Yes.
walk
Yeah.
outside.
And that's a good point. That's a good segue, I think, into nature cure.
Yeah. I love how we played that intro right
Yeah.
into that.
Because yeah, so sort of like politics and nature and how they intersect because like in how it pertains to one's health and
Hmm.
well-being, which I guess is sort of everything.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean it's a huge thing. I think like it's something I 100% took for granted growing up, is like having access to nature. I grew up in like middle class suburbs of Ottawa. Ottawa's a super,
Mm.
super green, very, outdoor activity friendly environment. Plus, you know, my house growing up was very close to the Greenbelt area, which is kind of protected land.
Mm.
And so there was always this kind of green space. I could literally put cross country skis on in the wintertime out in the backyard, go through a hydro easement right behind my house, and, take cross country ski trails. And so, it's something I took for granted until I moved to China, and then really started thinking through like what it means to have access to nature and not have access to nature based on, urban planning and the way that cities are designed, or the way, or where you live,
Mm.
or what kind of neighborhood you live in, even in a green city. Like,
Mm.
there's a huge difference, between sort of like the west end of Toronto where I am, and other parts of Toronto that don't necessarily have like ravines and parks, like large parks, right? You know, within walking distance, and
Yeah.
that plays out.
Yeah, I recently moved, well, I guess a year ago, moved to Swansea area, which is sort of near Hyde Park in the Lakeshore. So there are at least four, sort of in all directions, there's nature. You can go to the creek, the river, you can go to the lake, you can go to Hyde Park, you can go to just sort of these leafy, beautiful neighborhoods where they have random secret paths and like garden vines everywhere. But I moved from Keelan Eglinton, which is sort of, it's more inner city, I guess. And there are trails. There's still the Humber River
Mm-hmm.
and James Gardens, which is sort of this like affluent kind of like beautiful kind of nature trail thing that runs through that sort of intersects the Humber River. But even to get there from where I lived, you had to take a bus, and the bus would come like every 20 minutes or something. So it's a whole day affair, even though it's maybe a 10-minute drive away, and yeah, it's just sort of overgrown areas where they just I love weeds, but just sort of those like big prickly kind of like garbage strewn, like it just wasn't maintained or
Yeah, and
cared
not as
for.
inviting. And I mean, I
Yeah.
think, like it plays so much into health, and it's so much more critical now that, we're limited in our social interactions. And so we're more reliant on like different kinds of connection, right? Where we have to look at different ways of connecting, and we're doing it like through Zoom, like we're recording a podcast, or we're having like chats and like socializing over different kinds of media, but it's not the same as that kind of like actual live in real life connection. And so for a lot of people right now, they've shifted some of those sense of connections outdoors, or like are meeting with friends outdoors and trying to spend more time outside, in order to kind of improve and or maintain their mental health under like the unusual and unpredictable and challenging times that we're living in. And so, that just like highlights the way that COVID has highlighted health disparities, that access to nature piece. Like you're saying, like if you have to take a bus for 10 minutes, it's not the same as, for me, I can walk literally down my street and in 5 minutes, I'm in Trinity Bellwoods. Or if I go in a different direction, I could be in 3 other parks, that have reasonable tree cover, and, they're maybe not as dense forest wise as something like Hart Park, but at least that there is like some outdoor green space to walk through, and not just on city streets with buildings and a lot of concrete, which we know has health impacts on people. There's like 1,000 studies looking at the ways, in particular, that mental health is impacted by the proximity to green space, or like the percentage of tree canopy. But there's so many other kinds of things that have impacted on like how close you are to green space, like your actual lifespan, like how many years you're going to live, or whether or not you're more likely to give birth to a baby that's small for its gestational age, right? Like there's just, you name the kind of health consequence, and it has been, or condition, and it's been tied to how much green space you're exposed to, or blue space, depending on where you are. We're like stuck in the middle of a continent, so we always talk about green space, even though there's a lot of lakes around.
Yes, I love the lakes. Yeah, we'll get into probably the lake love.
The lake love, yeah. I'm sure we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
But so much of it has to do with like how much access you have, and I think now more than ever, as we're moving into those winter months, I've been like thinking and spending a lot of time planning, and really like feeling my privilege of having a car, so that I can like go out of the city whenever I want, or whenever I can, but also having the means and the kind of knowledge and experience to be like, okay, you know what, I'm just going to do a lot more camping this summer, and spend a lot of time in a tent. Or I'm gonna, buy myself cross-country skis, and spend, outdoor active time outside, which, is both like about ability privilege, in terms of like how I can move my body and what I have access to. It's about like financial privilege and being able to do that. And then there's like just, the fact that I grew up cross-country skiing. So I had that, that life experience at a young age, so that I feel like I can go into a store and be like, hey, I just need to buy skis, and talk to somebody about that, and know how to access it, or, have internet access at home, so I can like look up where to go skiing in Toronto, because that I wasn't as familiar with.
Right.
But also that I like know how to camp, or that I have a different association to like living in a tent for a week. And I contrast that, because I don't actually know about where you are in Toronto, but every park near my house right now is still full of encampments. And so there's a lot of people who, were in the shelter system, or who are like unhoused, or newly homeless, and they have, during COVID more so than previously, found that there's more security and safety for them living in tents in the park than there is living in shelters, or in other kind of cramped social housing situations. And so that they stay close to their communities. And so that just highlights it for me, is like, the way that I use I use Trinity Bellwoods as a park near me is different than, you know, lots of other people who are using the park as a place to live. And so
Mm-hmm.
for me, I can find solace there, but that's not true for every person. And, you know,
Mm.
that's not necessarily true for someone who, you know, whose experience of being in the park as a racialized person, you know, might be that like people question their existence or their presence in those spaces in a way that as a white presenting woman, I could just walk through and access, and nobody questions whether or not I should be there, or I should just be like hanging from a tree or climbing a tree or doing whatever, lying in the grass or doing whatever silly thing I happen to be doing. You know.
Yeah, you can just freely express, and people will sort of accept deviation from the perfect norm. Like, oh yeah, that's just someone being
Yeah. There's just a white
free.
woman hiding in the bushes, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, but she's sort of one of us. Like, yeah, there isn't. It's interesting too, the association with tents, right? So for the person who hasn't experienced camping, it's sort of this fun thing to do. You get to experience the elements and feel, but there's this comfort of knowing I'm choosing this, and this is for 2 nights or 7 nights, but I have this warm bed to go to
Yeah.
when I
I can go
want
back.
to.
I can put my shoes back on. I can, you know, go back and be indoors
Mm-hmm.
and not have to cook my food outside, or not have to think about, you know, what are the things that I could eat
Yeah,
while living in a tent.
the
Um,
comforts. Yeah.
yeah.
Actually, 2 days ago, I had this, it just reminded me of this experience I had a couple days ago. So I'm surfing until nighttime on Lake Erie in this town called Ridgeway, sort of like Fort Erie area. And it's dark. I get out of the water. It's pretty cold. The winds are like 80 kilometers an hour. I put my stuff in my car. And of course, and again, privileged to have a car, privileged to surf, have the gear.
Yep.
And I lock my keys in. And the friend that I'm with his phone battery dies. So I'm in this wet wetsuit. The winds are raging. It's dark, you know. And it was so I'm extremely uncomfortable, and I know I'm going to be uncomfortable for the next hour, let's say. But immediately there are these resources that I can draw towards myself, like Costco roadside assistance. So yes, my number is locked in the glove compartment, but I can call like the one number I know, my dad's number, like the one number I know by heart,
Yeah.
ask him to call for me. And then I can figure out how to go somewhere safe and warm. And again, yeah, as like white, cis, middle-class female, I can go to Tim Hortons, even though I'm wearing a wet wetsuit. So I look like drenched Catwoman. Like people are still nice to me. Yeah, oh, of course you can use my phone, and yeah, of course you can wait here, and can I do anything else for you? And you know, even the tow truck driver, their policy is not to pick people up and bring them anywhere in the tow truck. So now my car is parked far away, and it's very cold, so it's not like I can walk there once they unlock the car. But you know, again, like being of a certain privilege and of a certain identity, people who sort of like, okay, well, you're sort of non-threatening person, I'm going to take you to your car. So there's like these exceptions made just based on how I present, and I was super aware of that in those moments. Like it's uncomfortable, and I am like in sort of a down and out state right now, where I literally have nothing on my person, no money, no contact with
Yep.
anyone, and yet the people around me, and yeah, I don't even belong to this town.
Yeah, and you can trust that they're going to be kind to you and help
Exactly.
you. And I
Exactly.
think, yeah, I mean, it reminds me of a like slightly different scenario, you know, and some people might like find this like verging on, you know, torturing my children. But a few weeks ago, you know, we've been doing so much outdoor stuff because there's nothing else to do during COVID in a way. And we like it. And, you know, I really enjoy being outside. And so I forced my children to enjoy it because they've grown up in that kind of space. And so, you know, one thing that we, you know, decided to do, I was like, wow, you know, I saw this map that somebody posted, my partner shared with me and was like, hey, look at this map. Somebody cycled. There's like a whole cycle route of Toronto that you can actually do on green space, like including going up that Humber River trail that you're talking about earlier, where you basically like, you know, for us, we're not that far from the lakes. We would go down to the lake, go across, go up the Humber River, all the way up to Finch. For anyone who knows Toronto,
Pretty
like this
far.
is a huge distance. And then there's a hydro corridor to just bring me back to my youth, you could take all the way across Finch and then back down the Don Valley.
It's beautiful though.
It's gorgeous. It's almost none of it is on city streets, and it's also 75 kilometers.
Yeah, it's like, isn't there a bike race called the 100 that's sort of the bike equivalent of a marathon? So you're almost doing that.
I'm not sure, but yeah, we were pretty close to it. And I have an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old in tow. But we're like, you know what, we'll just take the whole day. We can bail at any time. We actually like left a car with a friend, like we left our keys to our car with a friend, and we were like, hey, worst comes to worst, you can come pick up the kids and like we'll travel the rest of the way if the kids can't make it. So there's all these like safeguards that we're talking about, right? And abilities to like kind of bail out at any moment. But we find ourselves in the Don Valley on a part of the trail on the way back that we were unfamiliar with, we'd never taken before. And so and it's starting to get dark. And then the battery pack for the phone that we had brought, as it turns out, had zero juice in it, like was completely uncharged. So we thought we had this backup phone battery. Meanwhile, we're running GPS the whole time. So our cell phones are dead. And which is crazy because I lived for decades of my life without a cell phone. So somehow was totally fine.
Yeah. In the last 5 years now, it's like you can't leave the house without one because you're completely lost. Yeah.
Yeah. And so but we're not totally sure how to get to this point where we are trying to go. And the trails in the Don Valley can be a little bit tricky at points because they don't always like clearly connect. Or there's like parking lots all of a sudden for a park.
Right. Or it gets really small and you're like, is that even the trail or is that just kind of
exactly. And so we're on one of those parts and it's starting to get dark and we're cold and we have no phone access at all. But at the same time, there's this sense like, it's okay. We're in the city. B, like we're not lost. I know that like, if we keep going on in this direction, more or less, like eventually either there will be people or we'll be able to like bail out of the Don Valley and like get to a surface street and do something or contact somebody or, just like flag somebody down and have that sense that, it doesn't matter, I'm going to be safe. And I think it's in those moments, like, even though I was feeling anxious and like one of my kids was like, who's afraid of the dark was like, and my other kid was super angry because we'd already biked over 50 kilometers and was like, I am done and I'm not talking to you. And I'm so angry at you for like forcing me to do this. And it's late.
Yeah, he's like, I didn't know what 75 kilometers meant when you first told me. Now I know. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I know. And I don't like it. And I don't want to do it again for a year, maybe. I don't know. But there's still, there's like all these backup plans, there's all this safety, there's all this sense, even if I feel anxious in this moment, even if I feel like this is a strain, that I can build resiliency through this, right? Experience, that I actually can connect to strength or connect to like skills that, and connection, with other humans or connection with myself in that moment to say like, you know what, I trust that I'm going to be okay. And that everything is going to be okay. And, and it's in those moments where you like have that realization that you're like, not everybody gets to feel that way in those moments.
Yeah. You're like, not everybody has this. It felt like there's many layers that I can go through before there's this ultimate rock bottom. And I wasn't even close. And then at the end of the ordeal, I'm going to end up in my car at some point because I own this car with all my resources inside, my food, my phone, my wallet, my sweater. And I'm going to end up in there eventually, even if the worst case scenario is like 5 hours, so, and I think you too, you're like, well, we're going to end up somewhere safe and warm at the end of all this. We just don't know how long it's going to take or what we're going to have to do to get there.
Yeah, and we can order pizza and like drink hot chocolate at the end.
As soon as we get home,
like
yeah. And it's like sort of like we have the privilege of choosing our adrenaline, right? It's like I can go on a roller coaster and get that thrill, versus actually being endangered, where this adrenaline response is now my body trying to keep me alive, and this is not the same thing,
Exactly. It's like you choose a situation to to like put stress on you that then allows you to overcome it, or like to move past it, or to, you know, get the release of the stressful situation going away.
Right.
And, you know, that's a privilege to make that choice, to say like, yeah, you know, let's just bike for 75 kilometers, even though we've never biked more than 30 in a day.
Right. Right. And
No
let's
big
just see what
deal.
happens. Yeah.
Just see what happens, and just,
Yeah.
you know, like go for it.
Yeah. And like if we're stranded halfway there, we can figure out some way to get back. Like there's always a way. Leave the leave the bikes, take a cab. Like there's all these options that you're like, you know, maybe I don't prefer these options, but they're possible.
Right. Or, you know, not just that there's like all these options, but that I know what to do in those moments. Right. I think, you know, you and I were like talking about like, you know, people who maybe didn't grow up with like camping experiences, or like don't have like an ease in accessing nature, even if they might want to, or they're like, you know, they immigrate from a place where like that connection to nature is like not available to them for whatever reason. And then they're like, hey, you know, I live in this, now I've like moved to Canada, and like they're like, the white thing to do is to like go camping and have a cottage, or like right, do all these things. I want to learn how to do that kind of stuff. And so, you know, there's like the financial barrier of like all the gear that's involved, you know, that like, you know, is part of it. Or like, do you have a tent? Do you have a sleeping bag? You know, do you have a sleeping mat so you can feel more comfortable sleeping in a tent? Do you have stoves? You have all these things. But then there's like the skill set and the comfort level to like know that, you know, in the end, you can trust that you know how to survive in that setting. It kind of reminds me of this other situation. Like, this was many years ago now, but we went for like a day canoe paddle in Killarney Provincial Park.
It's one of my
you know,
favorite
it's so great. But we were just there for the day. Like we were doing other things, and we, you know, rented a canoe. We just have a day pack, and we're in the canoe on this lake, and the lake it's like a bigger lake, so it's really windy. And it kind of, you know, like reminds me of your surfing story. And we're on this lake. We stop off on this little island that like maybe has like less than 10 trees on the island, to just like have lunch. We're like chilling out. And then one of my kids, I think my kids were like, they were quite young. Like, I don't know exactly how many years ago this is, but they might've been like 4 or 5 years old. And one of my kids' hats flies off their head and is in the water. And my partner's like, I'm going to go get it. And I was like, no, we should all get in the canoe and go get it together, because it's like really rough out there. But he felt like he could go get this hat on his own. He was like, it's not that far. I'll jump in the canoe. It'll be faster this way, rather than like all of us going in. And unfortunately what happened was he got in the canoe, and the winds were way too strong. And he actually ended up losing control over the canoe and not being able to like come back to the island because of the way the currents were going. Also did not get the hat. So I'm watching with 2 toddlers on an island as he takes the canoe and is like, I can tell he has lost control of the canoe, and the canoe is like floating further and further away to the opposite shore. And he can't hear me because of the way that the winds are blowing.
Oh no.
And I, you know, so I'm like, okay, I'm worried about him. He's gonna, you know, but he's an adult. But here I am on an island in the middle of the day, thankfully, but with 2 toddlers. And, you know, you know, all these things go through your head. Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to survive? Like, I have the water, but I have no food. I have no sleeping, like, you know, like there's no sleeping material. I don't even think I had a knife, but I was like, you know, not only did I feel like I had the skills to like calm my kids down, who were like, why is daddy floating off? Where is daddy going? Right. But also I was like, you know, I can bend these branches on this tree and do this to like kind of make an A-frame. And, you know, even though I've never done that before, I, you know, feel comfortable enough or have enough skill set that I could figure out how to protect us from the wind or the cold, should we have needed to sleep there. Like we didn't, but, you you know, like if I couldn't flag somebody down in another like boat, or if, you know, we didn't get rescued.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's
You're like, I
again,
have these, yeah, it's almost like this assumption that the world is like a non-hostile place ultimately. You know, it's like I kind of trust the world, even nature, to get through something, versus someone who may have a full-blown trauma response of like, here we go again, this is when I almost, you know,
this is where I almost die
died,
again.
essentially. Yeah. Or was complete, like had my safety completely threatened. um yeah. And yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. It's also a very scary situation though. You're like, I'm stranded on this island. Like, I think even, and I think like in those situations, like I remember sitting there in my wetsuit in the Tim Hortons being like, it's going to be over soon. Like once it's over, you're going to feel fine. But in the moment thinking like, oh, this really sucks. But knowing it's going to be over was very comforting, because it's like, oh, you can just get through half an hour of discomfort. It's not life-threatening discomfort. It's not even, it's like maybe a 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 on the discomfort scale, you know.
Yeah.
It'll be over. It's like if you break your arm, you're sort of like, well, I know this really sucks, but I'll be taken to a healthcare facility, seen relatively quickly, not judged too harshly, because again, how I present in society, and given relatively good care, and the pain will be managed and it'll be over. And so trusting this, like having this assumption about life and society, is very different than how a lot of people live.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is a good point, because and I think it's a good point too, to like nature presents itself differently to a lot of people. It's like barriers to access, because when I think of that, the neighborhood I used to live in, like, well, those trails were always there, but I never really saw people from the community there. It was always a certain kind of person, sort of like a James Garden type person, like wildlife photographer, like hobbyists in their 60s and 70s, you know. But it wasn't really the people that I would see in my neighborhood, like on the corner, like who would go to school in that area or work in that area or just hang out in that area. So like, but people don't know that kind of relatively close are these beautiful spaces to spend time in. It was like, that stuff is almost off limits, or it's not part of the consciousness of that area at all. We're not seen as a safe, enjoyable place to be in, like a random isolated park, you know. Yeah. And that those are just conceptualizations that I'm coming up with, but I actually don't know what the true barriers would be if I asked somebody, like, how come you never go to James Gardens? I don't know what that, you know, it's hard to
Well,
even.
and I think, you know, what we do know is like there are so many of those barriers, right? Like whether it's like, you know, feeling judged while being there, or, you know, not being like a relaxing space to be, whether it's, you know, that there's not like a positive, you know, like the baseline assumption even that like being in a natural setting or in a green space is a positive experience, or, you know, that there's like a value attached to connecting with nature is already, you know, something that people are socialized into in a way, or that, you know, has sociocultural aspects that we don't talk about all the time about, you know, what that means, right? You know, my in-laws are from India, and you know, they certainly like don't always get why we would want to do, you know, so much outdoor stuff, but they, you know, my father-in-law, for instance, like grew up in poverty in South India. And, you know, he was like, why would you, you know, walk around like, because for him being outside meant he had no shoes and there were scorpions. Right. And it's like a very, very different experience of the outdoor world and that sense of safety. Right. And so for him, he's like, why would you go backcountry camping? There are bears.
Yeah. It's like, we stay away from those areas. That is like uncharted jungle. Like
Right.
we don't want to be around those areas.
Right. There's like other, you know, non-human animals that maybe like don't have any desire to encounter. Not that I want to have a bear encounter. I thankfully never have. But I also have, again, like I have the skills and the knowledge on like how to do that safely, how to hang my food, where to hang it, you know.
Totally. Yeah. Well, we were talking about my friend who immigrated from India, but he had a job at a bank. So he had the financial resources, and he really was interested in starting to camp and really immerse himself into it. But there was a sense that I know he shared with me that he was like, I'm sort of entering into a world that other people have been immersed in since they were kids, and I have to learn sort of everything. And it was even like, what's relevant to know? Like we were talking about how I'm sort of learning how to whittle wood and start a fire from scratch. And it's like, yeah, but most of us bring matches,
Exactly. Yeah.
So like, like most of us, I think, I don't know how to start a fire whittling 2 pieces of wood. Maybe I could if I had to, but I think the stress of having to perform in that moment would probably make it impossible for me to actually succeed.
I own a flint and steel to
Yeah.
start a fire if I really needed to, but it's like a party trick. And generally we, use, I know how to do it with like matches, or I almost always bring a lighter, frankly. I don't even bother with the matches.
Right, yeah. Even matches, I don't even
just
know.
A lighter. Just a lighter is way easier. Although I, tend to have matches, but there is that, there is so much to learn. Like, what do you need to know how to do? What do you not need to know how to do? Who do you ask for to share this information on this basic level? And how do you, feel like you belong in that space with people who do that activity, right? And if you grow up where it's, even if it's not part of your like family experience, but you went with somebody else, or you had some experiences of doing this activity, that it's different than if you're like 30 or 40 and you're like, I'm going to try and do this. It's like when I tell people like I went downhill skiing for the first time in my life 2 winters ago, they're like, what do you mean you have never done this before? Right. And there's like all this reaction. Like I can't go skiing with anybody who actually downhill skis because I'm terrified of the hill still. And I'm still like, I'll see you. I'll be on like the magic carpet or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
Because there's I didn't have that experience growing up, even though I grew up in an area where there was a lot of spaces, or there was downhill skiing around where I lived. We just didn't do it as a family. And then I was training as a professional ballerina, and downhill skiing was definitely not allowed.
Right, you're like, that's gonna
you can't have leg muscles outside the ballet studio. No, it's not happening.
So interesting. I didn't know you were training to be a professional ballerina.
I was.
Wow. Oh, do you still dance just for fun, or
in my kitchen? Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I wish many times. So this is, I guess it's just an aside where I'm like, I wish I had some classical dance training so I could dance in my kitchen with a little bit more skill. Make it look more beautiful.
Yeah, I've like I don't dance with as much skill as I used to, for sure. So my claim to fame is that my like Russian ballet teacher would always say to me like that I had very good technique but very poor discipline. And I was like, well, he really pegged my like anti-authoritarian nature.
Yeah, that's actually kind of a compliment. Like I'd rather that than like I have great discipline and terrible technique.
It's true.
Because I'd be like, what am I? I'm just a robot then. You just program me to, but at least you're like, well,
I could do it. I just chose not. Right.
Yeah, right. Which is sort of how then you're like, I can take responsibility for however I end up in my ballet career, like,
just, or, oppositional. Kind of personality, but plays into like the activist in me. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're like, thank you for profiling me in terms.
Thank you for seeing me for who I am.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I feel seen. Yeah, thank you, ballet teacher. Like, yeah. I think I have a story about Rhythmika. I don't think I want to share it on a recorded podcast. Well, basically, I was like 6 or so. Rhythmika,
you're about to, so you might as well.
I am gonna share it. I might as well. So I forget how old I was. Hopefully young enough for this story to not be that embarrassing. I think I was like 6 or something. Like it was quite young. Rhythmika. It's kind of like a dance. Like they make fun of it in that movie Old School, but it's like ribbons and there's a ball. There were flags at one point, skipping rope randomly, and you wear a leotard, which is essentially a bathing suit, which I think is back in style now. Maybe I don't even know, with like leggings or whatever underneath the leotard.
Mm-hmm. Obviously.
Yeah, so like super 80s. Yeah. So okay, it was the 80s, so I was probably young. I had to go to the washroom and I asked the teacher, and this is like, we are not talented. It's kind of just like community school rhythmic. I joined because my friend was in it. And, and I wasn't a prodigy at this, let's just say. And I asked to go to the washroom. I guess my stomach hurt. And the teacher was like, no, you can't go. So I'm like, okay. So I went back to my seat and just had an accident, like a bowel movement in my leotard, which is unfortunate because it's like, and so so I'm like in that moment, like, again, my internal resources, I'm like, what do I do? It's sort of the same sort of mechanisms triggering when I lock my keys in the car. It's like, okay, how can I get out of this situation? This is a terrible situation.
Yeah.
And so I'm there and so I'm squatting, like really hoping no one notices. And the poo is sort of between my feet as I'm like in a not a squat, I'm sort of kneeling, and then she's like, okay, everyone take a seat on the floor and cross your legs. I'm like, uh-oh. So this is the moment when I need to get out of here. Like, that's an impossible posture for me to do with poop in my leotard. So I asked the washroom and she let me out. But yeah, that discipline is real. It's like we couldn't lose any time by me going to the washroom and avoiding shitting myself for the sake of the dance, And so I ran out into the hall.
It's like a bad lesson to teach children, right? But
yeah, like just hold your bowel movements in, and now you're going to be constipated for the rest of your life because you're wrong for having to poo at inopportune moments. But yeah, I ran out, and it's actually very similar to locking my keys in the car because my dad ultimately saved me. I ran out and he was waiting for me. I was like, I pooed. He's like, okay, we'll help you out with this. So yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess I was disciplined in that moment because I tried to deal with my gut and not have it interfere with rhythmica practice, but it didn't work out for me. Nature prevailed.
Yeah. And now we're back to talking about nature.
Yeah.
I was
again,
really
what's
in that moment wondering, like, how are we going to get back onto the topic? And there it is. Well played.
And it was just unfortunate. Yeah, I've never pooped I don't know. It was really awful time to poop yourself, but I guess there isn't probably a good time.
I don't know that there is a good time. In a way, it's like contained because you've got the leotard and like tights on or whatever.
The leotard kept it in, yeah, and the tights. I think I had tights, yeah, and it was sort of just all in there, like a kind of a diaper, and it's you're just like, oh, what's the damage that's been done? Yeah, but yeah. So let's talk about the benefits of nature because we did touch on them a bit, where you're like the difference. Essentially, it's like every positive health outcome that you can look at.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, as much as like we kind of had this conversation about like how not everybody feels like they have access to that, I think, the reality is that the research still like points to, and the experiences of people, of color or people who like previously didn't have access or have a complicated relationship to nature, like that they still have those positive experiences. And so it's not like we should just like write it off and say like, oh no, this is like an activity for like white upper middle class folks only. But that those benefits are like huge. It's everything from like lowered blood pressure, increased heart rate variability, like changes to stress hormone production. It's like kind of we talked about. There's like studies that where they look at like functional MRIs and look at brain waves and really find that the brain waves are more consistent with like a calm but alert state when people are in nature, and they're less likely to ruminate or have like kind of negative self thoughts or talk in when they're spending time outdoors. And it doesn't mean being active either. Like most of the research actually is not on people being active in nature, in the ways that like, not like surfing or backcountry canoe camping or whatever that we've talked about. But like most of the research is actually literally on like people walking through a park on the way to work, or living in a neighborhood with tree cover, or most of the research in like Europe, coming out of Europe and Japan, originally around these pieces are things like just like sitting in a chair in a forest, or looking out the window out of a hospital room and what people see, or out of a long-term care facility, and so it's not about being active like that. That has different benefits, added benefits, obviously, but the kind of overall heart health piece. There's there's lots of research on respiratory function and improved lung function. There's research on immune system kind of being more active or being more capable of responding to exposure to things like colds and flus. Just in terms of the immune markers, there's immune markers that they found from people in those environments that are more related to being able to, for the body to like address cancer cells, which we grow those abnormal cells all the time, that most of the time don't like turn into like a cancerous lesion or mass of any kind, but that there are these abnormal cells that grow and the body kind of, does its own like kind of cleanup job. And that the cells that do that are more active when people spend time outside. And, that it extends to like all sorts of things in like kind of more, I'd call the kid sphere, right? The like attention, ability to focus, ability to cooperate, like more kind of soft skills or executive functioning skills even are improved, like being able to focus on a single task and work better as a team. There's lots of research on kids outside and how that's played out, or even just actual improved outcomes with like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And, then there's like the obvious, when you're outside, I'm looking out my window as we're talking, when you're outside, you actually like focus your eyes on more distant objects. And so, you're actually less likely to like end up like me with my progressive lenses from like spending too much time on a computer or looking only at things at short distances. And so there's like, literally we could like go head to toe, and there are benefits to like health benefits to being outside.
And it's so incredible. Yeah, because it's like these benefits on the level of the like biochemistry, chemical balances in the brain or body, and then the level of even societies and how communities come together. Like I know one of the pieces that I've seen is crime rates in sort of urban landscapes versus more natural landscapes, and how like, we sort of blame certain communities where it's like maybe the landscape that they're in is contributing to certain behaviors because just of all these effects trickling down or manifesting.
There's actually fascinating research on like on green space and for people who are incarcerated. So folks who are unfortunately living in prison for too many of the wrong reasons usually, but there's a lot of research on like on what kind of images they see or how much access they have to outdoor and more natural spaces, whether or not they have like access to things like even just gardening and planting and plants and things like feelings of aggression or acts of aggression inside prison walls. And I think looking at that research, it kind of changes the nature of how we think about how we construct our societies and what it means to be human, and what like how important that relationship might be, and how we've often like overlooked it. We've just paved over natural spaces, and then cities now are like struggling to come up with all these like new ways to reclaim green space from industry, putting parks in the sky, or like it just becomes an expensive thing. We're like, oh, we have this like we have the gardener, what are we going to do underneath it or around it, or how do we reclaim things like the Los Angeles River, or right, and renaturalize some of these spaces, or what does that mean if we rethink how we interact with each other and with our environment. And I mean, that's not anything new. I think it's just like it's not that research is new, it's not that way of thinking is new. It's that in some ways we have an opportunity to rethink it, right? Like we saw it in Toronto. I mean, unfortunately, they just announced that they're like closing it, but they had this like whole push during COVID for what they called active TO. So the city of Toronto was promoting more like outdoor activities. They closed sections of major roadways to allow people to have like more access to natural spaces, or like greater access to outdoor physical activities, or, you know, businesses like put, you know, patios out on the street to extend more of like outdoor living
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
different ways. And I think, you know, it has forced us to kind of rethink what it means to live in cities, and how do we interact with those spaces, and what do we want? What makes a city a livable city? What makes a city a space connected and cared for and safe, um, and where, you know, folks can move around equitably, right? How does that all play out? How does green space become more accessible and divided equally in a way, or equitably in a way that everyone can benefit from it, so we don't have these kind of spots where like there's the people who get to live close to the ravines and because they can afford it, and then everybody else like has to live with concrete. And what does that mean, right?
Right.
Given what we know, you know, is that are we okay with that happening?
Right. Yeah. And how are we sort of, like you said, reclaiming? Because I think it just sort of happened where the concrete took over, and now all of a sudden it's like, oh, this doesn't feel that great, apparently, you know, after 30
Yeah.
years of just paving stuff. Now it's like, whoa, we're, you know, something we've always known is that we just feel better around green. It's actually, yeah, it's so interesting too that even looking out the window makes a difference in that physiological way. And it's like, you know, when you think of like how often like with planning or certain developments, they didn't pay attention to views. Like some people have views of the parking lot and the garbage cans, and others get the lake view, you know?
Exactly. Well, we kind of know that if you've ever stayed in like a hotel where they're like, you get the garden view or you get the like view of a brick wall.
Yeah.
But the same thing kind of applies in like, you know, like in hospital settings and long-term care facilities where people have better health outcomes, you know, if they have this view of green, or if, you know, even if they have like a picture, right? Like there's some like fascinating research happening around, I mean, again, old research and then newer research. The old research looked at like, you know, people who were having to get a biopsy done, which is like a stupidly painful procedure, and what, you know, what impact, or how do they perceive pain during the procedure if they had an image of a landscape on the ceiling during the procedure. So they like put these like beautiful, you know, whatever, probably in color, but like, you know, like Ansel Adams landscape photography on the ceiling. And the folks who had this view, as opposed to like just looking at a blank ceiling, they had a green view. They, you know, they had something to look at, and they could, you know, could experience that without pain. But, you know, other people don't you know, in other studies, like they've looked now at like virtual reality, and how, you know, how like even for people who can't access it, you know, what kind of benefits they might get just from like having a virtual experience of green. And that makes it more accessible in a different kind of way for some people. You know, like the hospital, the room with a view study, as it's called, you know, it's like an infamous nature study where like the people recovering from all sorts of surgical procedures recovered faster if they had a view of like a garden outside.
Which is so incredible, because once you have that research, it's unethical almost to make people pay for the view, or to have some people not have a view. Even if it's a lottery, it's still unethical to be like, oh, we know this person's getting the garbage can view, and they're probably going to experience more pain and have worse outcomes after their procedure.
Yeah.
It's almost like doling out pain meds to some people and not others, you know, or, you know.
Absolutely.
It's, yeah. So once we know this, it's hard to come back from it. It's like everybody needs a view.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to ask you about China, because you mentioned that that's when you started to really notice the effects of forest bathing, which actually maybe we should define forest bathing, because that's what your book is called. It's called,
right. I mean, that's probably fair. We've talked around it like a lot, but not really like talked about it. I think like the funniest is like when I first started telling people like, this is what I'm going to write a book about, even like people who know me really well were like, what is that? Like, do you have to take your clothes off? Like, is that like some kind of weird, like hippie activity of like,
You're hugging trees, you don't
you're
shave for
hugging
2 months.
trees naked, right? I was like, no, it has nothing to do with any of those things. You're not like sitting in a bathtub outside with like covered in cedar, which, you know, sounds actually kind of nice, but,
Just frolicking through the bushes, like with braided armpit hair. Like,
I mean,
oh.
that is true for me,
Yeah.
but not for everyone. But, you know, I think, if we like look at it, it's like it's a poetic term, right? But it's not something that's like new to human history. It's just, that, you know, forest bathing is a different kind of version of it. It's a literal translation of a Japanese term, that really developed because, you know, Japan, for many reasons, was like facing kind of both a health crisis in terms of mental health, and, especially for people, you know, working more in cities like Tokyo. They have high rates of suicide amongst men in particular, living in those cities. And then at the same time, their kind of agricultural exports were changing, and the use of their forests. They have a lot of forests, and that was changing in the 80s. And the way that they, you know, kind of brought those two things together almost, and like, you know, how can we rethink what forests are for? And again, it goes back to the, like, you know, what is there something about city life that has created these sort of certain conditions or environment that don't allow us to thrive in a way, or to kind of have the best health that we possibly can. And so there were particular researchers and research groups that started to look at those differences a lot more clearly, and convert some forests, especially near Tokyo, into these forest bathing areas, where research was conducted, but where, you know, businesses and employers would actually like bring employees out for like almost like an excursion, to try and promote, you know, stress resiliency, to try and promote better work product even, and efficiency, and better overall mental health, and just general health promotion through these kinds of activities, right? It's kind of like, you know, like a team building exercise, or you know, the things that don't happen in North America quite as much. You're like, oh, let's just all go out to the forest as a group. Unless you're like a naturopathic student, you're not necessarily doing that at work.
Like going to identify plants and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they started doing this, and that's where the term forest bathing comes from, is that particular historical tradition. And you know, to me, it's just part of like something that humans, you know, we like I said, like me, I think, you know, in general, for all of human history, we've been connected to nature. It's just part of our environment. And it's, you know, something that in kind of the more modern area, we like really haven't taken, we've taken for granted, and often, you know, just like paved over in many ways, or not realized like how much of an impact it might be should we not have those connections, right? That you know, we've increased our security, we have like roofs over our head and warm places to stay, and all these, you know, indoor cooking, and all these other great ways of being that have like allowed us to flourish in certain ways, and then also have disconnected from that piece. And really, like, it's also, I know for me, I connected to some of the work of folks who've like looked at what nature deficit disorder is, or defined what that piece is, and looked at the research of like what happens when we don't have that access to nature that we previously had, or we don't spend as much time outdoors, you know, doing these activities. And you know, it's something that has played out a lot in like research on pediatrics and kids' health in particular, because they're probably like in very recent generations in North America and in many European countries really shifted how much outdoor time they have, whether it's like outdoor time at school, or outdoor time traveling to and from school, and what that would look like, or just like kind of free play outdoors, right? As like a child of the 80s, you know, like I didn't have, I mean, even though I trained as a ballerina, I didn't have like a lot of structured playtime. Like there was a lot of free play in and around green spaces, even if it was like just going to the park without adult, so often without adult supervision because it was the 80s. And and like, just like, okay, what do you need? You just need sticks and maybe some grass and some dirt, and like, what are you going to do for the day? And there was always things to do. So there was this engagement that happened. And so, now we look at like for a lot of children, they don't necessarily have that relationship. They don't build up any of those skill sets or any of that comfort or that safety in those spaces. Right. And, for all of my like privilege, and we've talked a lot about like stress and trauma in a way roundabout, for me, I also like, I found solace in that piece as a kid. And I did take it for granted, right? Like my inside of my house actually wasn't always a place that I would consider like super emotionally safe. And I lived, with two parents, both of whom have mental health conditions. I have a brother who later passed by suicide, but really, really, really struggled as a young kid with pretty severe mental health issues as well. And so I, have this relationship for me that outdoor space, there was like a cedar hedge. To this day, I dedicated my book to the cedar in my front yard. That's like part of how I chose the house that I live in now, is that there was a cedar hedge in my backyard, and I would go and almost like crawl into it, and like a weighted blanket made of cedar. I was really not joking about the bathtub with cedar, and read books, or, find that kind of quiet, safer space for me in those moments. And, I think there's like that piece. And then there's just like the average kid who just doesn't get to play outside, doesn't have that sticks, has, very structured, organized activities nowadays, doesn't necessarily have that experience of risk that, you get when you're wielding a giant stick, or like you have two kids like lifting up a giant rock and like trying to haul it and throw it somewhere, or do whatever ridiculous thing that like kids or adults with kids' hearts do. And understand like what are the risks of doing that, or how does this play out, or how do I mitigate risk in that moment? How do I build that safety and security and sense of myself? And so it's like those two things, right? Like there's the benefits, and then there's like what happens when we don't have access, and how do we balance those things out? I know we've like totally strayed from like, this is the definition of forest bathing.
No, it's good.
But it's like, to me, it's really at the core, like of like what brought me to naturopathic medicine in a way. And, like in naturopathic medicine, there's this like idea, like the healing power of nature. It's like one of the basic kind of philosophical tenets that people talk about. And, I take that very literally in a way, like, right. Like that there's like the healing power of nature isn't just about like natural substances, but like literally the natural environment. And that does include concrete. It does include, for us, it does include these kind of more human constructed or defined spaces. But, maybe it also includes like a trellis with like vines growing up it, or trees in a public park, or, just like grass in the middle of the median instead of just concrete. And so, we can
some house plants or something.
Some house plants, some pictures of plants.
And it's interesting when it's framed, so when you're going through all the benefits, where it's anything from less crime to increased immune function. And when you're like, it's literally doing everything, every single health benefit, you can literally study, does nature help with X? And it probably does. And anytime I see that kind of thing, I always think, well, it's probably that it's not that thing is this magical cure for everything, but that the deficiency of it causes health effects, such as crime or immune dysfunction or whatever it might be. And so framing it as nature deficit disorder is interesting. I mean, it's maybe more shame-inducing. I don't know, actually. I don't know. But
it might be more shame-inducing, especially if you don't feel like you like have the ability to change that piece. I think
you're deficient and there's a disorder.
Yeah, there's like some kind of like there's something also wrong with you, or there's like wrong with
like how to But I think it's interesting to look at it from that perspective, because it's like your immune cells are begging for nature and they need it to work optimally, let's say. You know, your community needs nature to function optimally, to have the people within it experience less aggression and more calm mental states that lead to less crime somehow, and you know, whatever it might be. And yeah, people recovering from surgery need nature to help them recover for some reason. And yeah, and when we think of ND, putting someone in their optimal context, it seems to involve nature.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's like, to me, it's like not that far off from like other ways that we talk about social isolation. Like when we talk about like feeling disconnected from other people, or not experiencing like love and care and empathy and like all of the human to human connection pieces, that there is this other piece that's like, you know, we also have like human to tree connection, or human to grass connection, or human to like water connection, that those also, you know, like benefit us and nourish us in ways that are sometimes hard to measure. I mean, I think, you know, or somehow like to quantify, or to say like, this is, you know, absolutely 100% necessary. But, you know, if we, maybe there's like some space for, you know, that those like basic determinants of health include like connection to people and to other living things. And you know,
beauty, like,
and yeah, and to
beauty. Yeah.
And to beauty, right? Is like, it's like, it kind of straddles that piece between connection and art in a way. And so you know, sometimes literally, if you're like looking at like a landscape shot as your like screensaver on your computer, so that when you're like zoned out in the middle of the day, you're like, oh, look at that pretty picture, or whatever.
What got me through CCNM was this website called Cabin Porn. Literally, it was very pornographic images of cabins in the woods.
Amazing. You will link to that, I'm sure, in the
yeah.
like.
Well, now it's an Instagram account, but I immediately followed it, and it's like tiny houses. Yeah, just salivating
tiny
over
houses.
And like how everyone's packing their things into just very organized
fantasy like, cabin life.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like fantasy cottage.
Exactly. And just like, wow, I'm gonna wheel my tiny house to wherever my heart may take me, and just reap the benefits.
Park it in the woods next to a place where you could go surfing, I'm sure.
Exactly. Yeah. Somehow have like a second tiny house with the quiver of all the
oh yeah
maybe, or just the one board, who knows. Yeah. And yeah, and I wonder like what is the mechanism, because I've heard different mechanisms of how nature heals us. Like one of those things, like the fractals, because obviously the images themselves are beneficial if you can just look up the window. Something about the fractals. And then another thing I heard about positive ions versus negative ions.
Yeah. So I mean, that I like fully admit, I'm like not as up on like the positive negative ion piece. I think, you know, the kind of like basis of like a lot of the research is primarily actually like out of the Japanese research on phytoncides, which are like essentially like essential oils of plants and trees. And that, like a lot of the, you know, what we know about the way that those chemicals, like in pine trees or in cedar and in conifers in particular, but like also in like lavender and peppermint and like anything that like smells good that we want to make tea out of, that all of those kind of pieces, we already know they have like impacts on our immune system and our ability to perceive pain and all these other, you know, all of the health things that we already talked about. And so, you know, there's a huge chunk of like that mechanism that might be actually related to smell. It's kind of like a full sensory experience.
Right.
And then there's like the visual piece, like you were talking about the fractals, that, you know, that those kind of patterns in nature are, they mirror patterns within ourselves and the way that our bodies operate, or the way that we're structured on a biochemical and anatomical basis. And so when our eyes move through nature and see those patterns repeated, that also induces calm, because there's a sense of repetition of something that we know, or that and that it makes sense to us, even if we like don't recognize that we're looking at that, right? Like, you know, they like, I got lost in a sunflower, and like I just like went right into the middle of that sunflower, like most people aren't going to be like, oh, that's fractals, or, you know, that, or same with like an echinacea flower, but like that most people don't necessarily recognize it that way, but that's, you know, that's kind of the pattern that's repeated in seashells and in all of these natural spaces. And so it's that repetitive thing that makes sense to us on a very unconscious basis.
Like a sense of order in the
sense of
slight disorder. Like there's enough randomness. Like nobody likes music set to a metronome. You like a bit of randomness injected to make it satisfying, to hit your dopamine receptors.
Yeah.
You want to, yeah. So you're sort of like, oh, these tree branches kind of feel like my arteries.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Even though I look at my arm and I can see
you
the
might
vein.
not actually like notice that or even have any awareness of it. That that way that your eyes move also in those spaces, like again, matches the patterns of things like blood vessels. So, you know, those are kind of some of the kind of bigger things. And, you know, then there's like, yeah, I always think about like, there's like the more esoteric pieces of connection that maybe are not so esoteric, although like have been fictionalized in often bad sci-fi movies. But these pieces, like the way that everything, if we look at trees in particular and in forests, that everything is connected underground, and connected underground not just by root systems, but actually by fungal networks, right? Which, like, you know, some folks have very cleverly like termed the wood wide web.
Oh, wow.
I know, it's so cute.
I heard that. But I love, fungal networks are my jam.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's all about the mushrooms right now anyways. They're great for your immune system. There's so many other reasons to love mushrooms, you know, as long as you don't over harvest them. But and you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, be careful. Although there's so much turkey tail that you kind of can't go wrong.
I mean, turkey tail is easy to identify.
Yeah.
That's the one, exactly. And it's local and it's easy and it's great.
Yeah, and it's magical.
And it's magical and it's plentiful and it's wonderful for you. But there's also these like fungal networks that exist underground that actually, you know, in some ways they're equity distributors, right? Like they not just, we know that they help to pass messages and communicate between trees through underground networks, but they also redistribute nutrients. So they might distribute, like if there's actually a tree that's fallen over and has died, but, you know, those trees will still contain a whole bunch of glucose that then, you know, kind of seeps into the ground slowly but surely, and is then redistributed through these fungal networks and then to the roots of other trees in order to sustain the rest of the forest and help it grow. And you know, they're like you know, very Robin Hood almost kind of character, but also like this kind of secret underground network of communication. There's like a little bit of cachet to them in that way. And so, you know, I think about the ways that, you know, we don't really understand what our connection is to those things either, right? You know, how are we connected to the living pieces in soil? And, you know, and so, you know, to me, I always I'm reminded of that when I read the research on like, especially people with dementia and gardening. It's like a whole other thing that we haven't talked about. But, you know, that there's a lot of research on folks who garden are less likely to develop dementia in the coming years. But also that people who've already been diagnosed with dementia also see all these like benefits to gardening, even pot gardening, like a gardening in a pot, not gardening pot. But, you know, maybe that too, I don't know. But the research is really on, you know, having like these adults who are really like often struggling with cognitive function that then, you know, can be really scary. It causes a lot of anxiety and, you know, if you can imagine, like if you're uncertain about the world, then your behavior changes, and kind of ties into that criminality piece of that research, but also equally applies to folks with dementia and experiences of, or incidents of aggression when they're living in care homes, that those decrease when they are like have indoor gardening activities, right? And so coming back to this like fungal network piece, I am always thinking like, well, what is it about putting your hands in the dirt, right?
Mhm.
you know, whether it's like kids outside, right? You know, I'd like watch my kids. We were like on the beach in Kildare. It was freezing cold. They were like reorganizing all the mud. Doesn't matter. They're wearing like hats, right? What is it about our like desire to connect to dirt in different ways, to take off our shoes, for instance, or like put our hands in the dirt and like do this kind of active gardening piece? And potentially like what way, in what ways are we connecting to those fungal networks underground, or the roots of trees, or in those spaces, you know, that are these like imperceptible, and maybe that's also that positive negative ion thing that you could tell me all about. You know, that we have that connection. And then, you know, then there's like the basics of like, hey, if you're spending more time outside, you're probably getting more vitamin D. And like, if
Right.
there's one thing that we know is that like definitely being vitamin D deficient has a negative impact on your health, in like
Right.
every possible way you could imagine.
Right. It's like, yeah, the vitamin D, the nature of the movement, the soil microbes, even touching the nutrients, and sort of reminds me of the like evils of monocropping, where you remove these fungal networks and
Yeah.
topsoil. And I mean, I read many books about topsoil for a while, and it was too enraging. It was kind of like reading what's his name, Robert Whitaker, the about mental health, and sort of the state of psychiatry and the history of psychiatry. And it was just like so enraging that I couldn't deal with it anymore. So
Yeah.
like if I read too much about topsoil, it's upsetting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that there's that piece there, right? Like that, you
Mm-hmm.
know, aside from like the fungus, the fungal networks, not that that's
Yeah.
necessarily just like Termites, but,
Yeah.
or Coriolis, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But that, you know, like there's that other piece that you just talked about, right? Like how much of this is also related to like concepts around like that are related to like the hygiene hypothesis, and
Yeah.
how much exposure we have to the biodiversity of like of other biotic organisms, or like probiotics, right? That like the bacterial cultures that are present in the natural world, and like how much benefit are we actually getting from just having air exposure, contact exposure at these kind of, you know,
Mm. Yeah.
everyday levels. Not that we don't wash our hands or like, you know, but there still is that connection. And how does that, you know, how much do we really know about how that nature exposure also plays into gut bacteria, and
Right.
everything that we know about gut bacteria and its connection to health as well, in terms of like, you know, better ecosystem diversity inside us and inside and outside is like really critical.
Yeah, and it's great because that's the thing. I'm always interested in mechanism. I'm always like, what's the thing? But in the end, then it's the whole point of our medicine, really. It's like it's 1,000 different factors that would make someone experience disease, and 1,000 different factors that would heal that person. And you know, so it's like look at it at the level of like poverty and oppression, or nature deficit, or vitamin D, or whatever. That's probably all those things combined, conspiring together to worsen the situation. And then again, we just end up back in our principles of like air, water, sunlight, good food, and movement, and safety, and social connection. And
Yeah.
there you are,
We just
you're
go
back.
back to Maslow's hierarchy and we'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like we don't need to know why, like what's the specific thing. But it is cool because when you're like, wow, like underneath my feet everybody's chatting, like there's like all
Yeah,
the
there's like
mushrooms are
something
on
really
Reddit.
magical and like lovely pieces
Yeah.
about that,
Yeah,
right?
it's
Right.
like,
Just like I could
yeah.
just like take my shoes off and put my feet on the ground and then think about like what's happening
Yeah.
right
And
there.
phytochemicals, like when we ingest them, they communicate with our bodies to kind of trigger antioxidants and different things, because they sort of communicate the situations. The plants are aware of certain environmental conditions, and then they start to generate more phytochemicals. And then those are probably in the air as well. Like
Oh
in
yeah.
more essential oils are released, and but then it's not quite the same to just put essential oils in the air. Although you would get benefit from that. Just like looking at nature has benefit, you know, even though it's just not the visual experience that provides the health benefits. So it's like this multifaceted thing.
Well, that's just it. It's like, you know, we can take it all and like put it into pictures or into like these like virtual environments, or like diffuse a room with essential oils that like mimic a forest. And And we can do all those things. And I think like there's benefit to that, especially for folks who like don't have the accessibility of the outside world because they, you know, need constant care, they for other reasons like can't access. But at the same time, like we do know that like, you know, there are so many factors. And so like going outside and being in those spaces is always going to be better, not always easier. And so, you know, what are the ways in which we can like make that process easier, make it more accessible? And I think that that's the piece that's like really interesting is like, how do, you know, what kind of organizations, and there's tons of them, you know, like that help to do that, you know, help folks who like otherwise wouldn't have access to get outside, or help like someone like your friend, like, you know, like, hey, you want to learn how to camp? Like, okay, why don't you just come camping with me? And and modeling that, you know, that activity, or helping to like to mitigate some of the safety concerns that folks might have, you know, like and teaching people how to be out in the world. And there's like, I mean, I don't know too much about what's happening outside of Toronto, I fully admit, in that way, but I know that there's like dozens of amazing local nonprofit organizations doing that kind of work in cities across North America for sure, and probably elsewhere in the world, you know, who like are taking people who like live in the shelter system and helping them to like access nature in a guided, you know, safe way, you know, that's geared towards them, or that's like helping to teach kids about like how to identify an oak leaf and then, you know, and poison ivy so that they don't get hurt, you know, so that they understand like what are the dangers of going outside, but they feel comfortable in those ways. Or, you know,
or even as simple as learning how to swim, being comfortable around water safety is like big,
like
right?
Huge thing. And we like live on a giant lake. So yeah, it's really important.
Exactly. Yeah. I think I was reading, well, like there's more coastline around the lakes than our ocean coastline in Canada, which is pretty wild, which I was like, how is that even true? But I read it, so it must be.
Yeah. I mean, it would not surprise me if you think about like how many lakes there are.
They're big lakes. Yeah. There's
not just big lakes, but like then like there's a lot of lakes.
And lots
so if you're counting.
Yeah. Like every single, like
if you're counting every single body of water in like inside the mainland, that, you know, that probably does add up.
Yeah, exactly.
Seems likely.
Even if you count all the islands in the north, I don't know. Yeah, but it's kind of, the thing that got me excited about positive ions was that, so they say that nature has more positive ions, and apparently salt lamps generate positive ions, which I'm not sure about that. And then, negative ions. Salt lamps generate ions, nature generates negative ions. But more sort of like indoor spaces, technology type, electricity or whatever, generates more positive ions, which generate more of a stress response. But one thing that got me interested was this idea that water molecules hitting each other generate negative ions. So waterfalls and waves breaking, which is where you are when you're surfing.
Yeah.
You know, you really like interacting with that moment when the wave breaks, and that's where you are, you know.
I mean, that might make sense why people are so drawn to things like
and it's
waterfalls,
addictive,
right?
surfing. Yeah, exactly. And there's something like everyone will sort of describe that there's this addictive quality to it. Like it becomes a whole lifestyle versus a sport, and it's something beyond like snowboarding where it's got a lot of the same elements, but it's not this like this lifestyle. Yeah, so very interesting. So like maybe
I think it makes sense to me, because I know we have to like kind of close off at some point, but like I was thinking about that. I mean, I haven't read any of the stuff that you're talking about, but there's like a certain transcendence that people experience in natural settings sometimes, or with surfing. Like people talk, I don't surf, but I know people who do talk about, you know, like that there is like a meditative and transcendental aspect to the experience of, you know, of riding a wave or of staring at a waterfall. And I always think about, you know, there was this like trek I went on, again, me and like extreme nature sometimes. Again, I should have told you about all the like just banal, like just like wandering through the park. I mean, literally I do, you know, go through Trinity Bell Woods, like
just look at the grass
a few times a week and just like do a little loop, and then sometimes like go wander through the like edge of the bushes, literally, or like hang from a tree and then go home. That's like my usual experience. And I also do
instead of being lost without food for days in the backcountry kind of thing.
Yeah, not without food usually. I also know I also do know a lot of plant identification, and could probably just like live off of berries and barks and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Find enough chokeberries to get by. Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, the right time of year, blackberries. So there's that. Or blueberries. Depending on the time of year. Yeah. But yeah, so we were actually on this like trek in Ecuador. This is like a dozen years ago, and we're like at altitude, walked, kind of to this area called El Altar, which is like a blown out volcano, and so like we're at like whatever 4,500 meters altitude, and like on this ridge, and there are all these lakes in the area where the like volcano is. So there's these lakes at high altitude with like waterfalls, and then very kind of like nothing but condors as far as the eye can see, or like other peaks. And it's pretty amazing. It's like absolutely a magical place. Also like really annoying and hard to access, and like we hiked through a bog for 2 days, which I would never recommend anyone to do. And I was kind of tired also because I had altitude sickness. I'd never really been at altitude before. And I actually like I was on the tail end of a menstrual cycle when we were on the trek. And like, so I'm like, I don't have enough oxygen and I'm still bleeding. Like this is a really bad combination. So I was a bit more tired than the like 3 men that I was trekking with, and our 2 male guides as well. And so I was like, we were on this ridge and they wanted to go look at this like one other lake that was like over another ridge, but there was a whole bunch of scree, and I hate scree. I was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna like chill here because you've got to come back anyways, and like I feel safe. I mean, there really was nobody anywhere near there, and very few animals other than rabbits and condors. And so I was like, I'm just gonna just sit. And I watched these, like it was like a series of waterfalls coming off of a glacier. So that like I could see the glacier and then a waterfall going into like this like brightly colored lake at high altitude that then like traveled a little bit and then dropped down into another waterfall. And like that was my view. It's like,
wow,
unbelievable. But there is something about like these kinds of like looking at those pieces that's like both captures the beauty of that space, the kind of the fractal piece that we talked about, and then probably this like other piece of the running water, right? We come back to the blue, right? That like all like that there is this piece that is like I just was like I could just melt into this space and like become there's this feeling of being as long as you feel safe in that instance of like both a meditative state and feeling one and feeling connected with everything around you, that is transcendental, that it does have this piece or this ability to kind of move past like your kind of average, everyday, banal human existence, or even like what you connect to or what you're thinking about and how you feel about yourself, that just shifts in those moments or has the potential to shift in those moments. And running water does seem to be a piece of it, right? Like there is something very particular about moving water, whether it's like those that ability to make those negative ions as you were talking about, or something else about the movement of water that
like that has clean, and it resembles life and safety ultimately, because like, oh, we found water. That okay, we're good, we can rest here.
It's like a very evolutionary psychology perspective, but I think that there are pieces of that, right? And there's that I mean, glacial water too is like I don't could just drink this.
Right. Right, yeah, exactly. This is the clean water that's That's, yeah. And that
And
sense of awe.
so, like there's that sense of awe, right? Like if you ever like go to any waterfall or like just go to Niagara Falls, which is like so close to us, and like just watch people's experience of like it's like, and then like Niagara Falls is like rushing, dangerous waterfall water, but people are still just like enraptured by, by the view, by the way that we connect to those spaces. And there is something magical about it, and something beautiful, and something
just watching water free fall over a precipice of Niagara Falls, meditative. I was there recently, just like I have the urge to just like soar over top. There's rainbows. It's very amazing. Like, you kind of take it for granted because like, tourist site, but it's pretty magical.
But it is pretty magical. It's a tourist site because it's magical, right?
Exactly.
And even when it's frozen, it's like a totally different version of magical. I like went for the first time in the winter a couple of years ago, and I was like, wow.
Wow, this
so
is why
cool.
There's mugs like with this on it. Yeah.
It's like wild the way that the water freezes, but still is like moving and rushing and like.
Yeah, exactly. You just get the urge to like jump over it. You're like, wouldn't be a good idea, but
and it is. It's like it forces us to slow down and to like kind of just experience that gratitude in that moment, and like the awe, and be present fully. And so I think there's like that other piece, right? Like we don't, there's nothing else that you need to do, right? Other than just like stare at a waterfall, or like sit in a park on a park bench, or that like even if it's just for a moment, there is something that kind of forces you into a present space. And and that is a huge amount of healing power or health power to be able to just access that, and
just and feel those emotions and those states that being there puts us in, which is super powerful.
And on that, we'll like leave everybody with like how they're going to accomplish this, like like this moment of presence, or like what kind of space that they want to go to, right? Because I think there is that personal connection, right? And so everyone has that space, right? Like you're probably more of a blue person, and I'm more of a green person. I'm more of like a lake adjacent person. Like I would like the granite is really important to me, because I'm a child of the Canadian Shield. So that all about the granite.
Totally.
Something about the ions in
the rose quartz, or whatever, the crystals, or whatever you get.
There's tons of it's all the quartz, right?
So you're like sitting on rose quartz. You're like, this is like a giant necklace opportunity. Whatever bad energy is getting sucked off of this.
Whatever it is that rose quartz does, it is definitely doing it to me.
It's abundant right here. We're under my feet. And Lindsay, I know you have a patient in like a minute.
Yes.
But thank you so much for joining me. And I'm going to put links to your book, I know you're doing a course, which we didn't really talk about equity and naturopathic medicine. I'll put a link for that in your website and your Instagram. And any last thoughts before you run to pee before your patient?
I think it's just like, like for anyone who has like the privilege to like, just to be grateful for that like experience of being outside, and think about like ways of like increasing access to others, and like how to like, how to kind of make that connection between like activism in nature or health equity in nature. And think through like, what does that relationship mean to you, right? Like, or like, is it a positive relationship? How do you use it for like health and healing, or like transformation, or strength building, or whatever it is you want out of it? And hopefully there's like a piece that you and I talked about today that everyone can connect to, and or tag me on Instagram, and we'll chat about it.
Well, thank you so much, Cyndi.
Again, Talia.
And have a great day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.